Welcome to the Pearson Centre Conference on the New Challenges for the Canada We Want. This special session will focus on the Conservative Party. My name is Andrew Cardoso and I'm president of the Pearson Centre. I want to start by recognizing that the Pearson Centre is headquartered on the traditional lands of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples, and we welcome our speakers and audience who are joining us from across Turtle Island. As you may know, the Pearson Centre is a leading progressive think tank that addresses the challenging economic and social issues of the day. We are proud to say we are perhaps, and I think we are the only think tank that regularly invites representatives from all 5 political parties represented in the House of Commons, along with top business, labor, and civil society leaders, in addition to many other experts. As we like to say, we bring people and ideas together. A special thank you to all our donors and sponsors, especially our sustaining sponsors who are MAPCO, Ontario's Professional Employees, Canada's Building Trades Unions, and the International Association of Firefighters. And our special sponsors for this conference are Baylis Medical Technologies, the Hill Times, and the Canadian Health Coalition. If you would like to make a donation to see more of this kind of event, please feel free to visit our website, thepearsoncentre.ca. So just briefly on the format, we have an hour-long conversation where the moderator will engage in a discussion with our special guests for about 40 minutes. We will then take questions from you, the audience, so please send in your questions using the question box on your screen, and we will get to as many questions as possible, and we'll end promptly at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Our webinar today is on the Conservative leadership race and the Conservative Party. Where is it all headed? We have 2 very well-informed guests. Tasha Carradine is one of Canada's best-known writers and broadcasters. She's principal at Navigator, a conservative strategist, and co-chair of the Jean Charest campaign. A lawyer by training, she's practiced law, has worked for ministers in Ontario and the federal government, and worked for several think tanks, including Canadian Taxpayers, the Montreal Economic Institute, and the Fraser Institute. Named one of Canada's top 100 most powerful women for her work in media and communications in 2016, her career in media spans 2 decades in radio, television, newspapers, and online media. And I'm pleased to tell you, she's also writing a book entitled The Right Path: How Conservatives Can Unite, Inspire, and Take Canada Forward. This will be out in July and is published by Optimum Publishing. Now, Monty Solberg is our second guest. Unfortunately, you can't see him on screen, but he is with us and he will be on totally audio, although not visual. Monty Solberg was a member of Parliament from 1993 to 2008. He was a senior minister in the Harper administration and was Minister of Human Resources Development, where I first got to know him, appreciated his open style while he was a minister, and I'm glad to say we've kept in touch since. In addition to his high-profile cabinet positions, he was consistently voted high in the Hill Times annual staffer survey of best jokes in question period. And for this, all Canadians are deeply thankful to you. Monty Solberg is now principal at New West Public Affairs, a Canadian national public affairs firm based in Western Canada and headquartered in Calgary. I'm delighted to tell you that the moderator today is one of the conference co-chairs, Dave Bulmer. Dave is president and CEO of MAPCO. MAPCO is a politically nonpartisan union of some 15,000 professional and supervisory public servants in Ontario. They protect members' rights, defend Ontario's public services, and advocate for better working conditions for everyone. Dave is widely respected across the country for his strong leadership for public servants and his clear views on creating a more fair and equitable society. Now, I will return at the end of towards the end of the hour to help moderate the Q&A segment. And with that, over to you, Dave, hoping your sound is working well.
All right, thank you, Andrew. I hope my sound is working. I'm getting the thumbs up, so it looks good. A pleasure to see you, Tasha, and hopefully a pleasure to hear from Monty momentarily. Definitely excited to have today's conversation. So maybe we'll jump right in, and I'll go to you first, Tasha, and this is a very broad spectrum question. What is the status of conservatism in Canada now?
That is a broad spectrum question, but it's an excellent one. And I think it's really central to the leadership, which I know we're going to discuss, but it's central also, I think, to the political landscape in general. Conservatism can be many things to many different people within the conservative family or party. That's been represented by things like social conservatism, by progressive conservatism or red Toryism. It's by libertarians, fiscal conservatives. People tend to self-identify as to what maybe their main priority is. But conservatism in general is rooted in the ideas of smaller government, but not no government, balance of rights and responsibilities, importance of the things like we all cherish, which are things like family, faith, the community. It's a very bottom-up approach to organizing society. So this is sort of the general sort of thesis of conservatism that was developed, back in 1789 by Edmund Burke. So what does that mean today when we're facing challenges that Burke and original conservatives never envisioned? I think for many people, it's how do you apply those principles to modern issues? And you see those issues, things like climate change, for example, which was certainly not an issue then, things like the housing crisis, which we're dealing with currently in our country, sort of the importance or relevance of government in our lives in different ways. The pandemic has shaped that. Obviously, we've had to have a lot more involvement of the state in Canadians' lives in the last 2 years than they were used to before because of reasons of public health. So for conservatives to sort of look at all this, it's how do you apply those principles to those modern issues? And people come at it from different ways. And you're seeing that in this leadership. And some people say that, the most important value is to be free, to have as little interference in these things as possible. Others are calling for what you would say is more of, I guess, sort of progressive conservative vision of things like on mask mandates, for example, or other things, the community's responsibility to the community as opposed to simply individual responsibility. Still others are pointing to social conservatism and issues around the family and the role of government in regulating religion. So it's a basket of things, but I think what it comes down to is how do conservatives organize themselves around common elements in that basket to oppose the ideas of the other main governing party, which is the Liberal Party, which is not rooted in the same principles. It's a much more statist view of society and organizing society more from the top down. And we see that with this government, and not just in the pandemic, but in their spending practices before, in the tendency of Mr. Trudeau to sort of implement or try and change the shape of society, focusing on policy areas where some conservatives push back and say, this isn't you're demonizing us, and thinking, for example, the energy sector, fighting climate change in a way that people feel is attacking them as opposed to simply tackling the problem. And I'm referring here to Western Canadians. So to me, conservatism has to find a way to oppose the liberal ethos, but stay true to its roots and address those modern problems. So that's where we're grappling with. I hope we find maybe some answers or ideas in this conversation.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Monty, your thoughts on the status of conservatism in Canada now?
Sure. First of all, thank you to Andrew for inviting us to join. A real pleasure to be talking politics with my friend Tasha, and Dave, great to connect with you. Obviously, this is a very, very important leadership campaign for the Conservative Party of Canada. I think we're in a very good place, generally speaking. Clearly, we need to start winning elections, but there is a very strong core Conservative constituency in Canada. You see that just in the interest that's been generated in the race right now. And you see that really in
Oh, you're just breaking up, Monty.
Oh.
It's attached to it.
Are you still with us, Monty? Monty, can you hear us?
Uh-oh.
Monty, we're unable to hear us here on our end. I don't know if you can reconnect. Okay, maybe while we wait for Monty, I think we've at least got the silence back in the room, Tasha. And
I wasn't sure whether to jump in, yeah, because I know silence is deadly for any kind of webinar, but I was hoping hopefully he will reconnect, because I don't want to carry this ball by myself. I want to hear what he has to say, especially because he is from Western Canada, and it's incredibly important to have that voice in this conversation more than ever, I think, right now.
Absolutely. So we'll wait for him to rejoin us and for the signal that he has. So you and I can continue. So let's pick up with the Conservative Party of Canada has gone through 2 leaders in the last 2 federal elections. How does the party succeed in the post-Harper era?
That is also the question, I think, that a lot of people are saying. What does it take to win? Because success in politics is, of course, defined as getting into power. What does that imply? So I think you need to look back a bit at why the Conservatives lost and what it takes to move the needle next time around. And the party itself did commission a report into that, and they found a number of things. Canadians weren't really sure what Conservatives were standing for. That was one issue in the last election, and I think that sort of haunted Mr. O'Toole even after the election, the sense that people felt the party flip-flopped or changed positions quite quickly. There was a second issue that has been a hangover, unfortunately, since 2015, which I really hope the Conservatives succeed in dispelling, and that is the hangover from the barbaric practices snitch line. I even hate to bring it up, but it was found by this report that there's a perception that Conservatives are not necessarily always tolerant. And of course, the irony in that is, a lot of talk has been had in this particular race about tolerance of the ability to practice faith, tolerance of different views, a lot of focus on building bridges with new Canadians. So I hope that is one of the things the Conservatives have to do to succeed. So I hope they succeed in doing that. The other piece, of course, is where you win. And right now, the Conservatives in the last election, the last 2, have not been successful in the markets around the GTA, suburban Canada. They've not been as successful either in Quebec, which is a continuous issue that's, going back, I would say 2 decades now. And in terms of how the Conservatives really, or almost 3, succeed in Quebec. So I think those elements are the ones that the race is not just focusing on that, but it's part of the whole conversation is how do you make Conservatives appealing to those markets? Because in our Westminster system, unless you get a majority, you will not form government with a majority, and then you will not be able to implement, I would say, truly conservative policies. And we saw that with the Harper years, that in the first 2 minorities, it was much more difficult for the government to make headway on bills and always be on an election footing at the same time versus the last 4 years. So I think those are the challenges that the Conservatives face this time around. And I think they have to be very clear on what they stand for, what they stand against, but also what they're going to do in those regions of the country where there's more skepticism about them.
Yeah, thanks for that. Maybe just a follow up and anecdotally from my own perceptions. Whether you liked or disliked Stephen Harper, you respected Stephen Harper, and I think that every political party has its fringe candidates that sometimes can scare the general electorate, and I think that's fair on all sides of the coin. To be honest, I think with Mr. Harper, there was always a sense though that he was charting the course. He was at the helm and he was fully in charge, and I think he was a bit of a unique package. And my observation, I guess, would be that Mr. O'Toole, as the last leader, necessarily had to, or believed he necessarily had to run one way in the party and perhaps another way in the electorate in order to get elected. And whereas Mr. Harper, I think, was able to navigate both simultaneously without having to, cause himself that split, if you will. How do you see the next leader, whoever? I know you support Mr. Charest, but how does somebody navigate what seemingly requires attractiveness to separate crowds or to separate sides?
I think that is one of the big questions.
Before you,
there's Monty.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to make sure. I will let you go, Tasha. I just want to make sure people knew I was here, but I apologize. I gave such an interesting and eloquent answer and realized I was talking to myself. But At any rate, I will let you answer because I only caught part of the question. So
Okay.
by all means, go ahead, and then I'll jump in if Dave, if you want to ask or re-ask any questions, happy to.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, I'm glad you're here because I think that that is the big question for a lot of people is the issue of getting the party to a place where it can win an election. How do you win, first of all, the leadership and then take it forward? I mean, Mr. Harper, just to dial back for 1 second, he won the leadership with, it was an interesting situation. He had, I think, 58% of the points, but he had like 68% of the popular vote. And so he had a really broad support within the party when he won. Of course, it was the beginning of the party, and it was sort of shaped more or less, I would say, in the image that, you know, he is, as one of the founders of the party, the architect of its creation, saw. So it was perhaps easier in that sense for him to put a stamp on it, a stamp that everyone accepted, and then he took it forward to the electorate and got 3 mandates. Right now, the question is, if you run in the party to the base that is there, will that be acceptable or appealing to the larger electorate? And polling seems to indicate that it could go, you know, not necessarily. It depends what base you appeal to within the party. And that's the thing, is that the base right now is much more focused on issues that sort of I would say, the target voters out there that I think statistically would bring the party to power, i.e. center-right voters, blue liberals. There's a big opening there because of the NDP Liberal deal that is attracting people. And honestly, people are coming to the party and they're interested in the Conservatives because they think that the Liberals have gone too far to the left. So if you're appealing to that more middle Conservative or blue Liberal ground, if you're seen as appealing more to the other end of the spectrum, which is the more populist piece, that's really the sort of newer element in this leadership, not in the party. It's had its comings and goings throughout history in the Conservative parties, but it's the element in this election I think that is the most decisive, because if you go that direction, are you going to alienate people in the middle? And we're seeing, depending on the candidates, there's some candidates like Mr. Poilievre is much more axed on the populist segment, versus candidates like Mr. Charest or Patrick Brown, who are axed on the more center-right segment. And I don't think I'm being partisan when I say that. It's just that is where they're looking for support. That's where they're speaking to. So that is the debate: is, you know, where's there more growth potential? And statistically, I believe it lies in the center-right. You know, but this is the leadership that will decide that, is whether you can grow a base that is more populist to a larger electorate, or whether you have to go to the more center-right, which is the traditional coalition, I would say, of the Conservatives. When they have had a majority in this country, that's where they've always been sitting.
Okay, thank you. Let's hope we've got Monty secure this time. Monty,
You do.
Take maybe a couple questions to you. So the Conservative Party of Canada has gone through 2 leaders in as many elections. How does the party succeed in a post-Harper era?
Well, I think great question. I think the answer to that is it's got to find the messages that resonate with conservatives, but also those blue liberals that Tasha referred to. I mean, clearly that's critical. The party has not been winning in those, 56 or so ridings that were decided by 5% of the vote, and needs to more consistently win in those areas. So how do you appeal to suburban Toronto, Vancouver, et cetera? And the answer, I think, is, to focus on some of these issues that clearly are important today. So I'll just say a couple of words about Pierre Poilievre, who I've known since he was a teenager, going back to when he was in high school in Calgary. I really do think he's got himself a good issue on inflation and affordability. Those are issues that resonate today. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't have a very strong message, for instance, on the environment, climate change, and those kinds of things, which are of importance to a lot of people. But, as I was saying to myself, obviously, when I was trying to answer that very first question, a lot of people, I think, are focused today on the immediate issues and the ones that affect them personally, as opposed to things that are a bit more amorphous and that they perceive to be a bit more down the road, which means that probably issues like climate change just are not going to resonate as much as some people would like to see them resonate in the short run and in a leadership contest. We should have those, a strong message on that. And, there's been a lot of talk about carbon capture, utilization and storage, which should be a great strength of Canada's. And I think that's wise. But I think in terms of things that will attract support for Conservatives and help us get over the line in the next election, I think it's got to be the economy. We're coming out of a terrible recession. We're coming out of it quite strongly, thank goodness, because of all that pent-up demand, and to some degree because of the resource sector, in fact, to a significant degree. But, we can't lose sight of the fact that a lot of people are hurting. They're worried about security, both physical security, security of borders, and their financial security. They're worried about opportunity. And I guess I'd say as a final point, I think they're concerned about being respected. And I'll just say a word on that, Dave and Tash, if I might. I think a big elephant in the room these days is the Freedom Convoy and the divisions that caused amongst Canadians, but certainly amongst Conservatives. And my own view is I think the method needs to be separated from the message on these things. Even if we don't agree with people, even if we think that some of the things that they've done are just out of bounds, we should be searching hard as thoughtful people for the message behind that and what kind of message was being sent, and show some respect for that. And, I think that is where some candidates for leadership, such as Pierre and others, are probably to some degree on the right track, not because we want to encourage that kind of behavior again, but because we need to show respect for the message that was beneath all of that.
Monty, maybe that's a nice segue then to the follow-up I asked of Tasha while we were waiting for you was, how does one get elected leader and then get elected prime minister? As an outsider to me, as a centrist, it looks like the two are at odds with each other, given Mr. O'Toole's recent actions, where he portrayed himself, I think, as one type of leader internally and then tried to show himself otherwise externally, believing that that was the course needed to get elected externally. I'm interested in your thoughts.
No.
Somebody navigate that.
Well, I think part of the answer is to just sort of bridge from the last point I was making, is to bridge from demonstrating respect for people and their concerns, on the ground in some of these suburban areas, people who are members and potential members of the Conservative Party of Canada, and then taking that forward and going back into those suburbs and really finding out again, what are people saying? And I think in many cases, people will say we're concerned about the economy, opportunity. We're worried about where Canada's at in the world. I think increasingly Canadians are worried about things like the security of Northern Canada and whether or not we're properly supported or we properly support our military to ensure that our borders are protected. And I think people do want to hear their concerns reflected in the rhetoric of politicians. We can call that populism if we want. We can call it consultation instead if we want, if that's a better term. But I think people do expect to hear, as citizens of the country, their concerns reflected in the rhetoric of their political leaders.
One final question before we get into some more leadership specific and the candidates. I didn't get to vote until about 1990 or thereabouts, but I remember my dad, who I would call a red Tory or a blue liberal, routinely jumping from party to party from the time I was 5 until I was 20. He would move from one side to the other, and it seems to me, again anecdotally, that we have polarized that vote, and that free flow isn't there as much as it once was. And when I observe the Conservative Party of Canada, I see very few red Tories, let alone any blue Liberals. And it seems to me that that's where the growth would be required to be successful in retaining leadership of the country. And I'm wondering if Tasha or Monty, perhaps we'll start with Tasha. What are your thoughts on the space for red Tories and blue Liberals in the party at the moment?
I think it's an incredibly important space to carve out, because that is, I agree that is where the votes to win the next election are. I think it also reflects the tradition of Canadian conservatism, which is very different from that of American conservatism, or to reference what Nani was saying earlier, the issue of populism. I attended a rally yesterday that Pierre Poilievre did in Toronto, and it was very successful, numbers, lots of people, his message is definitely resonating with a great number of people. But the word I didn't hear during the entire speech was the word conservative. It wasn't mentioned once. And that really struck me, because if what you're talking about is, like you said, populism, it's what people are concerned about, but you're not framing it in a conservative lens, is that really a conservative party, or is it something else? And, people say, oh, it's like the PPC. Well, I think it's more like the Poilievre Party of Canada as opposed to the People's Party of Canada. I wouldn't equate, what Maxime Bernier is doing necessarily with what's happening in this race, but there's a certain correlation, because what you're finding is that there are people who are looking to see themselves reflected in political discourse, but it's not being marketed to them as conservatism. And that is a concern to me as a conservative, because I say, you know what, it goes to that whole thing that you're talking about jumping from party to party. If you want to build an enduring base, if you want to build an enduring party, not just for this election, but for elections going forward, you have to frame it and ground it in a set of principles that have an anchor, and say to people, this is the anchor, and you take us forward, and it's going to address, issues differently as they come up. But there's an anchor of principles of conservatism, and this is what it represents, as opposed to simply saying, what's in it for me? I talked yesterday to people at this event, and one of them said, after he was a 36-year-old man who said to me, classic millennial, and he said, I vote on what's in front of me, like, sell me what you're offering. And he's jumped from Liberals to spoiling his ballot to, in this election, he's interested, or in this leadership, he's interested in what Pierre Poilievre has to say. But the party itself as an institution has to think, what's it going to be after this leadership? And the red Tory piece you're talking about is part of the conservative fabric. It is something that will be alienated, I think, if you have, discussion of like vaccine mandates going forward to the next election. I know that is something that would honestly turn off a lot of people who say that is not something they believe. Law and order also is an incredibly important issue, and the Conservatives have a real difficult line to walk after supporting the convoy, because many people in that blue Liberal and red Tory space say, you know what, we didn't see law and order on display. We saw something that was the complete opposite. And that's the thing, is the principle of conservatism is law and order. A principle of conservatism, yeah, a free economy, but it's also good government, not no government. So to me, if you want to get those voters, you have to offer them something in the Canadian tradition of what conservatism is, and you have to frame it in that lens, and not simply say this is the flavor of the moment, and this is what people want to hear, so we're going to go over here. Because where do you end up then? 2 elections down the road, 1 election down the road, you end up with something that continuously changes. Is no longer a conservative party at all.
Monty, your take, is there space for the red Tory and the blue Liberal in the party as it exists?
Yeah, there is, and there should be. I think the mistake is to frame it as the blue Liberal and the red Tory. Those are labels that used to mean a lot more, I would argue, than they do lately. And I take Tasha's point. I mean, I think it is important that people who come from those traditions feel comfortable. And but every political party is a coalition. You don't always get what you want to get when it comes to the policies that are selected. You get some of it, and you saw that certainly in the Harper government successfully for 11 years or so. So it is, it has to be part of what we do. People need to feel comfortable, but I think when it comes to general elections, people aren't necessarily sort of hung up on the labels, I would argue. I think most voters are impressionistic, and they vote based on an overall impression of whether or not policies line up with their priorities, and whether or not the person that is putting themselves forward reflects their overall values, they like the person, etc. And I think, that's obviously a great strength of someone like Jean Charest as a veteran politician. But I think it's also the case that Pierre Poilievre has matured greatly in the last number of years and has become a lot more than that one-dimensional caricature that, has sometimes been painted of him. And it'll be the challenge for all the leadership candidates to bring all of that to voters to win their support.
Okay. Thanks, Monty. Let's stay with you. So unbeknownst to you, Monty, when we were in the virtual green room, and I got kicked out myself, I have to admit, we talked a little bit about the nominees and who's in the race. And I believe yesterday was the deadline. I think there are 8 candidates. I'm not 100% sure if that's factual, but I'm interested in both yours and Tasha's take on how the race is shaping up to date. So what are your thoughts, Monty?
Well, I think it's a very good sign that there have been a number of people put their name forward and intend to run. There have been, I think, last I heard, I believe there were 4 candidates who had made their, put their money down and had supplied the 500 names: Leslyn Lewis, Pierre Jean Charest, and Patrick Brown, I believe. I'm not sure about the others, but that is these are high quality candidates in my view. People that have proven track records. They've done some things in their life politically, and it means that there'll be a lot of attention, I think, focused on the party as people make their way around the country and bid for support. The other good thing is, in my view, is, we're seeing a very dynamic policy landscape right now. When the race started, Ukraine and the war in Ukraine wasn't even on the horizon, and all of a sudden it's there. And now all of a sudden we're seeing a really good discussion about national defense, and so that's a new issue that has popped up. And all these issues will get fully vetted, over the course of the campaign, and I think prepare the party very well as it heads into whenever that next general election is.
Okay, thank you, Monty. Tasha, your impressions on the race thus far?
Well, I think it's definitely a robust slate of candidates. I echo Monty's piece on that. I think it's attracted a lot of attention too, both inside and outside the party. That the issue will be really for the election of the leader, memberships and sales of memberships and how they shake out in terms of areas of the country, because the party has a system whereby you need 100 points in each riding, you get a percentage of that, and that percentage is then allocated to you on successive ballots. As people drop off, the lowest one always drops off, and then their points are allocated, their second choice points are allocated to other candidates as this rolls along. So what you end up is that you have to basically make sure that you have enough representation to hang on to the last ballot. And so people are targeting in this race. It's quite clear actually that the 4, I'd say, candidates most talked about, which are Jean Charest, Pierre Poilievre, Patrick Brown, and Leslyn Lewis, are all approaching it from a different angle. And Jean Charest is approaching it from the angle that you referred to earlier, sort of center-right position, the big tent, the traditional coalition that you had under Mulroney and also under Harper, because Harper actually shifted his position between 89 and 96 to say we need to have the blue Quebecers, we need the red Tories in Ontario, we need Western reformers as they were then. So that coalition is I would say where Jean Charest is heading. Pierre Poilievre is taking the tack of more populism, but also I think generational marketing. Like I said earlier, he's looking at younger people also who may have not had a political affiliation and try to bring them into the fold on this basis. Leslyn Lewis is looking to social conservatives. That is clearly her base, and campaign life is out and out said, like, vote her. So there you go. And then you have Patrick Brown, who is reaching out to new Canadians in a major way, and in the GTA specifically, but also I know in the rest of the country from what I understand from his campaign. So the growth for the party, what I find interesting in this is that at the end of the day, you know, everyone has to come together to support the party in the next election. If it grows in all these different ways, there actually is potential to have a winning coalition, unless some of these elements, you know, are seen as inconsistent and can't live together. So the challenge will be really living together. I think we definitely need, for example, new Canadians in the party. There's no question. We need to reach out do a much better job of that. We need to get those blue liberals in the party. We need to keep our base in the party too. We don't want to alienate people who've been giving their support to the party for many years. It's making sure that anything new that's brought in can stick around, and that it's not swamped or dominated by one side, because then yes, people will not feel like we basically need unity in the party. And that's going to be the trick, is getting unified behind the leader, having a leader who can unify too and speaks to that and can move the party forward in the next election. And then I think the race will have been successful in growing the party the way it needs to be done.
And you touched on
Dave,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I just want to jump in on a couple of things that Tasha said. First of all, I think, you know, Patrick Brown should not be underestimated. He surprised everyone in the PC leadership run a few years ago and signed up, 40,000 people, a lot of them newcomers. And this has been an extraordinarily important part of the Conservative base in the last number of years, when Jason Kenney was so successful rallying newcomer communities to the support of the Conservative Party in the 2011 election. I mean, he really did bring them in, and they are natural conservatives in many respects. So I think, you know, that is something that will be important, and you know, a reason to pay attention to what Patrick Brown is up to. You know, last time he was so below the radar, and he's continuing to work below the radar this time, and you know, that makes it dangerous for the other candidates to underestimate him. So, you know, that'll be interesting. And now I forgot my second point, but we'll go on here. I'll think of it later. So let's go back to, I'll let you go back to it.
Well, you've actually segued me to a future question, Monty. So I'm going to stick with it. No sense swimming against the tide. Tasha, what are your thoughts on Patrick Brown? So I'm from Ontario. He ran against Ms. Elliott a few years ago and quite literally organized her out of the leadership. Came from nowhere, signed up tens of thousands of members. What are your thoughts on him? We just heard from Monty.
Sure. I agree with Monty that Patrick should not be underestimated in terms of organizing and networking with primarily new Canadians. That is his focus as mayor of Brampton as well, which is a community that has a very high percentage of first-generation Canadians in it. He has been doing that for a number of years too. He also, I mean, he has roots in the former Progressive Conservative Party as well. I mean, he was an MP. People sort of forget that from way back in the day. He was a conservative, but he's someone who has been active in the PC party as a youth leader. He was originally, I remember he was actually youth president after me, which is really funny to see everyone that you know from back in the day. Is and it's good actually. It actually speaks to something I think the party, and it's a hobby horse of mine, should have a youth wing again. But I digress. I think he brings an energy to it too, an Ontario focus that's important. But yeah, to Monty's point too, we don't know. Like we really, it's hard to say. It's a bit of a black box because we don't know where the membership sales are distributed. You can have, 5,000 people in one riding, but if there's another riding that has 100 people in it and you sell 100 memberships there, well, now you have half of those points. Whereas in the other riding, if you sell 100 memberships, you have like point, I don't even know what the math is, but practically nothing. So it's targeting your ridings too. That's one of the tricks for all the campaigns. They have to look and say, where is our growth potential? Where can we go to ridings where we can make a difference in the points? So I think that's something that we can't predict at this point in time, is who's doing the best job of that as well.
Okay. I'm going to go back to Monty. And Monty, I wanted to ask about Mr. Poilievre's campaign. And seems that from my perspective, he's doing the shock and awe. I'm in the lead. I'm going to lead wire to wire. He's almost wanting to push people out of the race is the sense that I'm getting early. He is pushing further right than I thought he might. And I'm wondering, given the populism and so on, that's not so popular with the electorate outside of the party, how do you see that juxtaposing? Is it worth his while to make that push into the right towards the People's Party and scooping up some of that lost electorate? Or is that going to harm him in the long run if he becomes the leader?
Well, the first thing I'd say is, I mean, the crowds he's getting are amazing. It really is impressive. And, you know, I don't think anyone should underestimate the importance of that. Clearly, you know, to Tasha's point, it doesn't mean that you're going to necessarily win because when you have all those votes concentrated in a few ridings, if you do, it, you know, it doesn't help you a heck of a lot. So you need to sell a lot of memberships, but I think these crowds are probably an indication that they are selling a lot of memberships. And there's a story today about them confirming that they've sold in every riding in the country. So if that's the case, you know, they're off to a pretty good start. So that said, it's always the challenge for candidates to ensure that they don't say things that put them so far offside in the leadership campaign that they are unelectable when it comes to the general election. He's got a smart team behind him. I'm pretty certain they feel confident that they're not doing that. They know they've got to reach out and win in those suburban ridings. And I would make this point, actually the point I wanted to make earlier, you know, now that the Liberal NDP coalition is in place till 2025, I suspect a lot of Canadians are going to say, you know, the Liberal Party of Canada that I've supported for a long time does not represent me anymore. And there's going to be a lot of those votes sort of floating around looking for a home. And I think that means that, you know, all the Conservative candidates need to think hard about how they appeal to these potential new Conservative voters. And that may mean, you know, considering ideas that they hadn't really emphasized in the past. And certainly when it comes to climate change, that's going to have to be one of them. There's no doubt about it.
Ashley, your thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, polling shows clearly that you have to have a position on climate change that makes sense to people. You have to have a position that you have to have a position, period. It has to be clear. It has to be something that they can wrap their heads around. You can't ignore the issue. And you also can't, I think, make promises. You shouldn't make promises you can't keep. And it's great to say, well, you know, we should have Energy East. We should have a pipeline across the country when, you know, Quebec has said no to it. How do you square that circle? You know, saying, and I know that's one of the things that, you know, Pierre Poilievre, since we're discussing him, said, you know, last night he also said, well, you need a choice of currency. People should have a choice of what currency they use. Going to the whole Bitcoin crypto piece. There were lots of cheers in the audience from, I think, a lot of the crypto bros who were there. And that's interesting, but it's actually false because it's not a choice of currency. I mean, cryptocurrency is really, it's more of an investment than an actual legal tender. And he said you don't have to have it as a legal tender, but the point is that making these kinds of statements or promises to, you know, how are you going to keep that after the election? And if people put all their money in crypto or decide to pay with crypto, then they lose their money. It's not really, you know, choosing your money, it's losing your money, and people don't want that. So I think we have to be careful, and people have to make responsible statements in what they're doing. So that is the challenge, because those are some of the details that could be seized on then by the voters you're talking about, the more moderate center-right voter who will say, that turns me off. And I go back to the, you know, the convoy too, it will turn people off. It will turn some people on, but it will turn other people off. So you have to make the equation. Well, are you turning off more people than you're turning on? I think that's the ultimate decision or ultimate metric that we have to look at for what leaders are saying or aspiring leaders are saying in this race.
Okay, I'm cognizant of the time and that we'll want to save some time for questions from our audience. I have one final question. Maybe I'll start with you, Monty. Given the I'll call it the accord between the Liberals and the New Democrats and the possibility that there won't be an election for quite some time, something that is a recent occurrence and that is no doubt is causing the Conservative Party to adopt its longer range plans. Regardless of whomever the leader is in September, how do you see what could be the remainder of Prime Minister Trudeau's tenure playing out from what's the conservative approach, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Well, it's very hard to say. I mean, you know, this is such a dynamic, or there's such a set of dynamics around that relationship between the NDP and the Liberals. And then, of course, sort of the entire policy field is dynamic because of world events primarily. So if I was the NDP, I certainly wouldn't trust the Liberals to do some things that blow up that accord if they think they can force an election early and get some kind of an advantage. I think there's a 50-50 chance that the accord actually lasts until 2025 when it's supposed to expire and we'll go into another election. I think there's just as good a chance that, we'll see an earlier election. And that's something that the Conservatives need to be ready for. But I think the biggest set of issues that we can sort of foresee coming tend to be around the economy, whether it's the impact of supply chains and inflation and spike in energy prices and these kinds of things. The Conservative Party has traditionally done very well on economic issues, and those are the kinds of things that I think we need to be ready to respond on. Pierre has had a good message on that. Jean Charest has had a strong message on that. We need to reflect, again, the concerns and the hopes of Canadians around having opportunity in the future and feeling financially secure. And so if I had to say, pick one or two issues, it would really be in that area. And I think, this has been commented on before, that to some degree, the NDP and the Liberals are really focusing on issues now that people may say they feel are important, but they don't feel it sort of on the ground day to day. And so when there's a big, discussion about climate change, for instance, in Glasgow or wherever, people may say that they feel it's important to tackle it, but the way they behave is, they complain about the high price of gasoline at the pump. And that's what I think political parties need to reflect if they want to get elected.
Okay. Thanks for that. Tasha?
Yeah, I think big issues will be economy and unity. And by unity, it's a different conversation than we had for around Quebec for many, many years, where Mr. Charest, for example, did play a very large role in keeping the country together. That was one of the things that he's best known for from the last federal or provincial referendum on that issue. But I think Western unity right now is a big issue in this election. And I think that you address that through a number of ways. It's the issue of how do we square the energy and the environment circle, right? Making sure that Westerners don't feel disrespected for producing energy that we all need, clearly. But at the same time, having a climate policy that as a country makes sense, that achieves targets, that encourages other nations around the world to do that too, through the activities that we do here. And, a strategy for production of electric vehicle batteries, for example, using what's in the ground in Canada, building on our heritage. Again, this is a very conservative view. We seek to conserve the good and reform the bad. That's, in fact, I'm paraphrasing Disraeli here. That was his original, one of the original visions of conservatism. It's incremental, but you look to what you have to conserve. And conserving the environment can start with a big piece of our heritage. The Ring of Fire, critical mineral strategy, which I know Mr. Charest has talked about extensively, and other candidates, I believe, have also touched on, but that is like a big thing that could be a vision for this country. I think people are hungry for vision. They don't want just policies that affect them personally. I think that is a big piece of it, but I think a vision piece, a unity piece, where do we take Canada in the future piece, something different than the Liberals, who are basically just offering more of the same, i.e. we're going to spend money on stuff to, show the government's your friend and keep you happy. Well, it hasn't worked, and we're just going to get more in debt and pay higher taxes in the end.
Thank you, Tasha, and thank you, Monty. I appreciated your thoughtful responses to my questions, and we'll turn things back to Andrew.
Thank you, Dave. I've got a couple of questions that have come in, and certainly you can feel free to chime in as well. So the first question, it builds on some of what you've talked about. With the Liberal NDP agreement, the next election is not expected till 2025. Is it good or bad for the party and the next leader to have those 3 years? And maybe I'll just ask you to, if I can interpret this a bit, to focus on the organizational aspect as opposed to some of the issues you've talked about. Is that too long a period for the new leader, or is that just about the right time? Maybe Monty, you can go first.
Sure. Well, the first thing I'll say is that, Stephen Harper once famously said that the worst job he ever had was as leader of the opposition. And that has to do with managing caucus. Caucuses are so difficult to manage when you're in opposition. You don't have the discipline of power. There's no cabinet to appoint people to or to remove people from. So it does make it challenging. That said, there will be excitement about a new leader. And I think a new leader will be given a lot of latitude to go ahead and put his or her stamp on the party. Because of course we've just gone through a couple of leaders and we're heading into an election. So the new leader will benefit by having that time to organize. And if the party is kept together and, the three people who end up not winning go away more or less happy or at least not angry, then we can pull together the supporters they brought into the party, their organizers and their donors. And, that means that you're in great shape going into an election in 2025 if that coalition lasts that long.
Thanks. Tasha?
Yeah, it's a bit of ifs there, Monty, and I am concerned about ifs too, to be honest. I think that it's one thing to bring in new members and people who adhere to what they see as a set of values and principles that are, that have conservatism at their root, that are consistent with what the party has espoused in the past. And it's perhaps more difficult when you bring in people who have absolutely no political affiliation whatsoever to keep them around to do those kinds of things you're talking about, such as working on campaigns, volunteering, getting involved on the grassroots nitty-gritty level. Because at the end of the day, elections are won also on get out the vote. They're won on organization. You need to build that machine and have people who are ready to get engaged in the political process beyond voting. So that's going to be, if the party can translate what they're doing now into that, yes, the 3 years will be very useful. I think also we'll probably see, potentially some regime change on the Liberal side. Mr. Trudeau, I think, will make that decision, his calculation, whether he thinks he can win the next one. And if he can't, well, he'll pass the baton. And that will depend, I think, also perhaps on who's elected leader for the Conservatives, because they'll judge their chances by who is the opposition. So the Conservatives have to be ready for that. It's not just that, we may not be facing Justin Trudeau in the next election. It's great to say I will beat Justin Trudeau, but what if it's Chrystia Freeland? What if it's Mark Carney? What if it's somebody else? We don't know. But I think that, that the Conservatives have to use this time wisely and say, we are going to go to ground and organize, build up those riding associations, fundraise, do all those things in a way to have a machine ready as well as a set of policies and a leader in the window.
So you both seem to be saying that the NDP, or you haven't actually said it, I'm putting words in your mouth, but the NDP Liberal agreement really benefits the Conservative Party in as much as you get a longer time to organize, and plus you're able to make the case that the Liberal Party has moved to the left.
I think that the latter part is the big opening. The question is whether we'll take it. And that's I think the Liberals have made a miscalculation in terms of thinking that this is going to help them. I think this is going to hurt them in the center. If the party moves to the center and the center right, I think that it can take advantage of that. If it doesn't, then if there's another leader in the Liberals might swing it back. We don't know. So the opening is there, and we'll see if we take it.
Monty, I'll ask you the question that Tasha answered before I got to it, and that's the change of, if there's a change of leadership in the Liberal Party, does that change things for the next leader and the party?
Well, it undoubtedly does. To some degree, campaigns are crafted around the approach that leaders take on the other side. So there's no doubt that it will have that effect. It really depends on how sure-footed a new leader is, if there is a new leader, and what issues that person focuses on. If it's Chrystia Freeland, for instance, she brings a record to the table, and that's always good and bad. In her case as finance minister, she would have to take responsibility for some very large deficits. Unfortunately for her, even if she did, manage to reduce the deficit this last time around. And then the same thing applies in a different way to somebody like Mark Carney and the positions he's taken in the past and some of the organizations he's been involved in. So no question, the Conservative Party, no matter who the leader is, will have to respond to the leadership of the Liberal Party. But every party is used to doing that, and that carries positives and negatives going into 2025, if in fact there is leadership change.
Okay, one last question from the audience, and I'm paraphrasing this because it was a very long question, but should Pierre Poilievre win, it will be a party of anger and a party of fear. How do you address that anger? And I'll start with you, Monty, on this one.
Well, I mean, I can tell you that Pierre Poilievre is a clever guy, and the last thing he's going to do is allow himself to be characterized, without a fight anyway, as angry and promoting fear. He knows very well that they need to win those urban and suburban ridings. They need to be stronger. Conservatives in general need to be stronger with women, an area that we haven't done as well as we would have liked in the past. In fact, we've gotten beat up pretty badly with women. And so there's no question that they'll be aware of that and will be, crafting messages and selecting policies appropriate to winning that support back. But, that applies equally to everybody, of course, who's running. Everybody brings a record. Everyone has to own their policy positions. And as always, those things cut both ways.
Tasha, your take on that last question?
Yeah, well, I think Erin O'Toole has a lesson in this. You've got to run as what you're going to run on later. And if Pierre has appealed to anger and discontent against things like vaccine mandates quite openly. He's appealed to anger against Trudeau, which I think all of us are, Conservative Party angry against Trudeau, but in a way that's been expressed very viscerally. If he does, if he moves his positions to more center right after getting elected by appealing to, as Erin O'Toole did, the more, I guess, blue or in his case, people say People's Party elements, will those people then be angry at him? And will he suffer the same fate as Erin O'Toole? So I think the lesson in this whole thing is actually you got to run on what you're going to run on at. So if your intention is to build a big tent, you've got to say that now and not appeal to what is seen in some cases as anger or fear, because then if you then pivot from that, the party is going to go the same way as it did the last time. So the lesson in this leadership to me is be yourself and take that forward. If you want to build a big tent, then do it now as opposed to trying to do it later.
Okay, thank you very much. I just have a quick note for the audience, and then I'm going to turn to Dave for the final word. I just want to remind the audience that we're halfway through our annual conference, which is going to go actually till May the 6th. We're just extending it an extra week because there's a lot of interest in one of the sessions we wanted to have next week is going to be the following week. So on Friday of this week, we have a session marking the 125th anniversary, the 125th birthday of Lester B. Pearson. There will be a webinar with Senator Landon Pearson and Ambassador Bob Ray talking about his record and his relevance today, especially around the UN and multilateralism. We've got a number of sessions next week. We talked about just transition yesterday, and next week we're going to be talking with Labour Minister Seamus O'Regan, continuing that discussion. Some of today's discussion will be carried on in a session next week on democracy in danger. And as I mentioned, there's a number of sessions coming up, so please visit our website, thepearsoncentre.ca, to see how those are panning out, and feel free to register. With that, I want to thank our two guests, and I turn to Dave for the final word.
Thank you, Andrew. As a lifelong public servant, I always enjoy hearing from all political sides, from one side of the spectrum to the other. So it's been very enlightening to hear from both Tasha and Monty today. And I want to thank you for your thoughtful responses. Thank you to Andrew for once again having Ontario's professional employees take part in the Pearson Centre activities. We very much enjoy our partnership, and I wish everybody a good afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Monty.